I'm not going to get too much into the details on that, just go through some quick thank yous and talk about the lineup for tonight. First of all, I think we feel fortunate that we were able to work through everything this year, given everything that was going on. I want to thank the administration for keeping us in compliance with the university rules, our researchers and our grad students. I'm happy that those grad students were able to finish their projects. A lot of that was up in the air earlier in the year. And of course, our staff here at SEPAC, a lot of times they get overlooked, but these guys take a lot of personal pride in what they do, and I want to recognize them. As I look at our lineup tonight, I think we did a pretty good job of putting things together. And one thing, personally, I think it accentuates the importance of having these regional research stations. If you look at some of the long-term things that are on the program tonight, we got Dr. Kladivko on a 35-year summary of a project. Alex Helms and Camerata are going to talk about some research that's been going on for over 23 years. And then also the regional aspects of as these specialists take their programs across the state. So there's a lot of regional differences. Obviously, people say that our soils are unique down here. We know what that means. It's a code word for, not too good. But so our soils responds differently. Castile's work, some of his big research projects he's been working on, it's, things are showing up different across the state. The same way with Dr. Talenko. If you look at her work with some of her fungicide applications and foliar diseases, down here we can get some frog eye, southern rust, and up at other areas of the state they're seeing tar spot, white mold, different things. So I think this is a good program that highlights the benefits of having regional outlying research centers. Without further ado, I think we're going to turn it over to Eileen, and Eileen's been a cornerstone, her project here at SEPAC for a long time. And I always say we're limited by how good researchers and projects that are going on at any one time, and this is certainly one that's had over 25 publications and numerous students, and a lot of good data came off this. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Eileen.
All right, thank you very much, Joel. Can everybody hear me? Somebody nod. Yes, okay, terrific, thank you. So thanks, Joel, for that introduction, and I want to thank Joel and Don Bealey before him and all the staff for making this project possible over this 35 years. But since I have less than 30 minutes to talk about 35 years, I'm going to go ahead and get started without any further ado here. So let's go ahead and get started on drainage for the long haul. And obviously this is just going to be some key takeaways from this long-term SEPAC project. As you all know, naturally poorly drained soils give us many challenges for crop production. And so one of the water management practices that is commonly used in many areas of the state and the region, as well as worldwide, is subsurface tile drainage. So it is a common water management practice, although it was not common in southeastern Indiana before this project began, and that's why we were asked to do some research on it. Tiles, as you know, generally don't flow all year long, so they are seasonal in function, and that has something to do later on when we talk about nitrate. That's an important factor to keep in mind. So again, I don't have to tell you folks who are attending a SEPAC field day where SEPAC is, and this project has been going on since 1983. I do want to remind those of you who were around in 1983 for SEPAC, and let those of you who weren't around know what our original goals were. Basically, on this poorly structured, low organic matter, naturally poorly drained soil, the Claremont Silt Loam, the goals were, first of all, to improve drainage, to test out modern perforated plastic drain tubes that had not been tested out before in that region, but also to improve soil physical properties. As most of you know, that soil has a lot of issues with crusting and erosion, and we wanted to increase infiltration and permeability and reduce crusting and erosion. And of course, we wanted to improve crop growth and yield by using drainage. So the setup of the drainage research site of the main experiment, which was the spacing experiment, was to we installed drains at 4 different spacings so that we could test out the effect of spacing on yield. The particular spacings were 5, 10, 20, and 40 meters, or 16, 33, 66, and 132 feet. This project started when I had barely arrived at Purdue, and there were 3 very experienced researchers, Ed Monk, Jerry Mannering, and Ron Wheaton, who designed this project. And they told me that basically if the spacing was this far apart, if drains were 40 meters or 132 feet apart, for that particular soil, it was basically like it wasn't drained at all because it was so slowly permeable. So that was our undrained control. The tiles were installed at 2.5 to 3 foot depth, which is above the fragipan, which is at about 3.5 to 4 feet depth. And we used standard 4-inch plastic drain tube with no sock or filter. The drains were installed in February and March of 1983, particularly warm, dry time period before the drought of 83. The main drain was installed parallel to Highway 50 here with the standard laser guided equipment of the time. The laterals went more or less perpendicular up into the field, but they exited first into a culvert so that we could measure flow and sample water before they then went, before it was routed then into the main drain and into the ditch. So let's get right into some of the results. Drainage pays. We're going to hit that several times today. The first way that we might think about drainage paying is that it improves the timeliness of field work. So during the first 10 years of this long-term experiment, the different drain spacings were chiseled and planted when the soil was ready for each individual treatment. Okay, so we were using spring chiseling, and spring chiseled on one day and planted the next day. And basically the decision was made by Don Bealey, and sometimes in consultation with me when I was there, about whether a particular plot was ready to be tilled or not. And then the next day it was planted. So the undrained control plots were delayed anywhere between 1 and 15 days compared to that narrowest drain spacing. And you understand, of course, what happens, right? On one day, the 5 meter is ready to go. And so we till it and then plant it the next day. And the next day, the 10 meter is ready to go. We till it and we plant it. And then it rains, right? And so then that sets back the undrained plot and starts again from zero. And so in a couple of years, we had significant planting delays because of that. And obviously you all know that more timely access to the field is a major benefit to most farming operations. This image here that Joel gave me a little while ago, showing some of the images of what the soil looks like from a satellite. The blue lines, he superimposed the drain lines on top of this aerial photo, but you can see the light colored area of this part of the field is where we had the drains. The dark colored area, the wet soil, is where we didn't have drains. So it's very clear from the air that the drains were very effective in draining out excess water and helping the soil dry faster than where we didn't have drains. So our first question, would this modern perforated plastic tile even work on the Claremont soil, has been answered many times in the affirmative. Yes, it certainly does help drain that soil. Okay, let's take a look at the yields. We're gonna do this in a couple of parts. I'm gonna look at the first 10 years first, which is when we were chiseling and planting each plot on its timeliness basis. So if we look at the 10-year average first, on the left we have the narrowest spacing. The dark blue is the 5 meter, and then we go progressively further and further apart, and the light blue is the undrained control. So on average, over that 10 years, we had a 10 bushel yield difference. Okay, so where we installed the drains compared to where we had no drains, we had a 10 bushel yield benefit. Frankly, that was less than what we had anticipated, but there's a number of reasons for that, and I'm going to go into it. Among others, we didn't have very many wet years in that first 10 years. But if you look at each of the years over the 10 years, you'll see obviously a lot of variation. And in some years, the narrowest drain spacing was the highest, and we stair-stepped down as the drains got further and further apart. The yields became less. In some years, the intermediate spacings had the highest yields. In 7 of the 10 years, the undrained control did have the lowest yield, okay? So even though it wasn't as much lower as we had thought, it was clearly lower for the most part. So that was our first 10 years. We only had 2 years actually where we had significant delays in planting because of intervening rain. And so that's part of the reason we didn't have as much of a difference as we had originally thought. But hold on, later on we had much more difference. Another thing that's of course of interest to most of you would be the grain moisture at the time that we harvested. And this is again an average over the 10 years, and we were growing continuous corn in that first 10 years. So the narrowest drain spacing had about a 21% grain moisture content on average, and the undrained control was on average 2 points wetter, right, up at 23%. So obviously, again, that means more drying costs where you don't have drainage because the grain is wetter at the time of harvest. All right, let's look at later time periods. The last 10 years of the corn in the corn soybean, because later on we went to a corn soybean rotation. So let's look at these later years. In some years, like 2007 and 2011, there still wasn't a whole lot of difference in yields among the different spacings. But in the rest of these later years, you can see a tremendous impact of no drainage, right? The light blue bars here are much lower in yield than the other 3 drain spacings, 50 bushels difference or more, because we had wetter years during that time period. So obviously here we have much more of an impact of drainage, in part because of the weather. There is another aspect of timeliness, if I can kind of bring that up or talk about that. One is getting planted on a timely basis to begin with. The other one is, do I have to replant? And that's kind of a timeliness issue too. So starting in 1994, when we switched to a corn soybean rotation, we switched to no-till. And because we did that, we planted all the plots on the same day. We didn't need to wait anymore until the top 6 to 8 inches was suitable for tillage. Because we were now no-till, so just the top 1 to 2 inches had to be suitable. So we basically planted all the plots on the same day. But obviously, if it continued to be wet after planting, in the extremes, that might mean replanting. And so for the undrained, here's one example. In 2017, all the plots were planted initially on May 16th, but the 40-meter or undrained control didn't make it. So here you can see on June 12th, after replanting on June 2nd. You can see kind of in the middle here, you can start to see the rows from that corn growing from the replant, whereas on the left and right side here, you can see the plots that, the drained plots that did not need to be replanted. So this is another aspect of timeliness. Okay, maybe you get it planted, but if you have to replant it, that early planting didn't do you any good. And so this is another benefit of drainage, less replanting. Okay, so the bottom line related to the yield is that drainage does pay. Drainage improves crop yields. This is the average of all the corn years from 1984 to 2017. The undrained control here averaged 144 over those 24 corn years. All of the drain treatments averaged in the 160s. And if you look at that narrowest spacing, it averaged 168. So 24 bushel yield benefit. So these increases in yields of 20 plus bushels on average over that whole time period is obviously much more impressive and much more significant than what our original 10 years was. Another question I've gotten before is, well, you know, what's the yield? What have the yields done trend-wise over the course of this long-term experiment? Have they kind of matched genetic potential just in general? This is a messy graph, but I just want to point out a couple of things. The dotted lines that are going up and down are the 3-year moving averages of the yields from the undrained control versus the narrowest drain spacing. But if you look at these dashed lines here, these are the trends. So this dark blue one on the top, the trends over this 34-year period for the 5 meters, so the closest drain spacing, it trended up about 1.9 bushels per year on average over that 34-year period. Obviously a lot of bouncing up and down, but the trend was pretty much right where we would expect it based on improved genetics. The light blue line here you see is flat. Actually, it goes down just a little bit. So that's the undrained control. So we're not seeing any benefit of improved genetics or anything over the 35 years. That yield has pretty much just remained flat. So the bottom line of this is if we want to be able to take advantage of improved genetics and improved technologies, we have to start out with a field that has decent drainage. Soybeans on this particular field, on average, we haven't seen any yield benefit. If you look at the average, the last columns here, basically no significant difference in yields among all 4 spacings. Obviously, this 2018, the undrained control was a lot less than the others, but in 2014 and 2016, the undrained control was actually the highest yield. So on average, over the years that we've had soybeans, from 94 to 18, which is about 12 years or so of soybean years, we didn't have any yield benefit. Okay, what about surface drainage? We do have good surface drainage on this field. Many of you have told me that. We have slightly more slope than many Claremont fields, according to you local folks. So we would expect that the importance of subsurface drainage is not going to be as dramatic on this field as it would be on some of your fields that have less than perfect surface drainage. So we had one illustration of this in another part of the field, the impact of tiles versus no tiles at all, on another part of the field where we had less ideal surface drainage. So the foreground here is an untiled portion of the field. So another part of the field, a different experiment that lasted 10 years. And this was the year after that experiment ended. You could see that they planted it 3 times and it got drowned out 3 times, okay, because it did not have good surface drainage. The water ponded and there was no tiles to take it away. In the background here, you can see the corn stubble from the drained area of the field, good growth, and basically the drains were able to take that excess water away. So again, for those of you who have bigger fields and fields that don't have absolutely perfect surface drainage, this kind of an impact is a huge impact, right? Where you get drowned out areas, and if you've got tiles, it takes away that most of that drowning out. All right, let's look at a slightly different aspect of drainage pays. One of the ways it pays is that it improves cover crop growth. So if you are going to the trouble, which it's a good trouble, I think, because cover crops are very useful. But if you're planting cover crops, you want them to grow, right? You want them to do something for you. So this is just one example. This was mid-May of 2016 before we planted soybeans. And it had been wet, and so we hadn't gotten in real early, but we didn't worry about it because it was before soybeans. So here's our cereal rye in the tiled area of that spacing field. And we had about 3,100 pounds of top growth biomass per acre, which we then terminated the next day after we sampled it. Down here on the right, we've got a picture from the untiled part of that field. You can see it doesn't look as good, not nearly as much growth, looks kind of puny. And we had less than 1/4 of the growth that we had in the tiled area, right? Around 700 pounds of biomass per acre. So again, if you're going to plant cover crops, you want them to do something for you, which means you want to have enough growth that they can actually be a benefit to you. And so this is a big impact of drainage. The picture I just showed you is from 2016, and we did have a particularly large amount of growth that year, in part because it was wet and good weather for cover crops, in part because it was before soybeans, so we let it grow longer. This light blue bar is that undrained control. But even in these other years where we had less growth, the undrained control was always less in growth than the 3 drain spacings. So again, drainage pays if you're trying to grow something like cover crops. I'm going to move on now into another part of the field where we did a different experiment for the first 10 years or so. Most of the time when I've talked about this project, I've focused on the 4 drain spacings, and that's what I've just been talking about. But let's talk for a little while about drainage experiment number 2, where we had subsurface tile drainage block versus no tile drainage. So 2 different subfields. The purpose of this experiment was to try to improve soil physical properties and soil biology. So those other objectives of the project that I mentioned at the beginning, okay? So we split the plots, chisel versus no-till, and we had 5 what we were calling agronomic practices that were designed to try to improve soil physical properties. So our control was continuous corn. So CC here is just continuous corn, not cover crop. We then had continuous corn with a winter cover crop of either wheat or cereal rye, different ones in different years. We had another plot that had continuous corn with a winter cover crop of annual ryegrass. Another one that was continuous corn with dry manure spring applications. And then the last one was a 3-year rotation, corn, wheat, orchard grass, red clover, meadow. For all of these, we hand broadcast the covers into the standing corn each fall because they were pretty small plots. And so that's basically how we did it at that time. 2 different kinds of points that I want to make with this graph. The blue bars are the tiled and the red are the untiled with yields here in bushels per acre. The percents here is what I want to point out first. That's the percent increase in yield for tiling compared to untiling for each of these treatments. So for the continuous corn here, the tiled was 12% higher in yield than was the untiled. But for all the other agronomic management practices that we were looking at, the cover crops and the manure, the tiled was more like 20% higher than the untiled. Okay, so we saw more of a benefit for tiling where we had those other practices. Another way to look at it might be to just look at the blue bars first. If you look at all these agronomic practices, they yielded equal or higher than continuous corn where we had drainage, where we had adequate drainage. You look at the red bars where we had those agronomic conservation practices, they yielded equal or lower than did the continuous corn. So basically those agronomic practices weren't working real well because of the poor drainage. I've done a little bit of work on and off over the years on other soil properties and earthworms. This was in that experiment that we ran for 9 or 10 years, as well as other work that I've done on earthworms. But generally, earthworm populations were generally higher where we had no-till versus where we had chisel, and that goes along with a lot of other data that we have and others have. Earthworm populations were generally higher where we had tile versus untiled because the untiled was simply too wet. Earthworm populations generally were improved where we had cover crops and rotation and manure versus the control because we gave them more food. So all of those things are consistent with what others have found in other soils as well. Soil physical properties tended to be improved by the cover crops and the rotation. They're kind of variable, but they tended to be improved in particular aggregate stability, which is related to erosion resistance and infiltration. Again, particularly where we had good drainage versus where it was untiled and where we didn't have good drainage. So my takeaway from that is basically that drainage enables other conservation practices to work better. So if you have a naturally poorly drained soil, conservation practices such as no-till and cover crops and rotation with hay crops are more effective in doing what you want them to do for your soil physical properties, or nowadays we'd actually broaden that a little and say soil health. It's going to improve the soil health more where you have adequate drainage. So in the tiled versus the untiled fields, if you're on a soil that is naturally poorly drained, that needs drainage, okay? So my bottom line from this is that adequate drainage really is a necessary first step if you want to improve crop yields and soil health on poorly drained soils. And I've already shown you this picture. Again, if you can't grow a crop and you can't grow a cover crop, you're not going to do a very good job of improving soil health or soil physical properties. The last topic I want to talk about is a little different. It's more related to water quality. Closer drain spacings lose more water, and therefore they lose more nitrate in the tile drain flow. Obviously, if you put tiles closer together, the whole reason you do that is to get rid of more water faster, right? That's why you put them closer. If you get rid of more water faster, that water is carrying nitrate. Since nitrate is not held by the soil, any nitrate that's in the soil, if more water flows through the soil, then more nitrate flows through and out the soil. So I'm just going to show you some of the data from the early time period of the experiment when we were using high fertilizer nitrogen rates and continuous corn and no cover crop. You see here the yellow bar is the 20-meter or 66-foot spacing. We were losing on average 23 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year coming out the tiles. As we brought those tiles closer together, more water came out and therefore more nitrate came out. So the blue bar here for the 5-meter or 16-foot spacing was 44 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year that was being lost out the tile. That's quite high. That was typical for the Midwest at that time with the management practices and the fertilizer rates that we were using at the time. The good news is that we have improved that, as have others, and we know that cover crops is a really important part of that. We added cover crops. We also did change the nitrogen fertilizer rate because we were now in a corn soybean rotation and extension recommendations had changed. So both of those things together, the cover crop and the reduced nitrogen rate, gave us reduced nitrogen concentrations coming out of the tile drains. And so it gave us smaller losses as well. We still have less loss where the tiles are widely spaced and greater loss as we bring those tiles closer together. But overall, we were down in that 10 to 15 pounds of nitrogen loss per acre per year. So a much better improvement in the water quality as a result of keeping those tiles wider and having the cover crops. The picture I kind of like to use to help illustrate that cover crop thing, again, is that we know the corn and soybean system by itself is normally fallow from October to April. Most of our flow, especially at SEPAC, starts in November and flows on and off all winter, stops flowing in June. In a typical year, right? There's not much flow in the middle of summer and early fall. So if we plant a winter cover crop in September or October, it's there taking up nitrogen even before the tiles start flowing. And so it reduces that concentration that comes out all winter and early spring. So the cover crops have been shown to be very effective at SEPAC, but in a lot of other places in the Midwest as well, in reducing those concentrations and those losses from our fields. So I have two final slides. The drainage is a long-term investment. We know that the drain flow itself develops with time, right? The drainage system doesn't work as efficiently the first couple of years. It does take a little time for that to develop more. The yield effects, of course, vary from year to year based on the weather. Conservation practices themselves take time to improve soil health, even without the drainage issue. But the long-term improvement in cash crop yields and cover crop growth and the effectiveness of other conservation practices make tile drains a really good investment. So if you would like more details or you'd like to hear parts of this again, there are 3 videos that are available that are split up by, the first one is yields and timeliness, the second one is cover crops and conservation practices, and the third one has a lot more detail on the nitrate than what I just did. That's available at my drainage website. If you prefer to read, I've got 3 extension publications on those same topics, and that's available at the Purdue Education Store, as well as at that drainage website. So with that, John, I think I am done, and I can stop sharing my screen if that's probably what you would like me to do, right?
Yes, Dr. Clavico, thank you so much. That was really informative and really a great segue into our next presentation. Next up, we will have a potassium fertility talk with Dr. Jim Cambarato, who is a soil fertility and nutrition specialist, and Alex Helms, who is on staff here up at SEPAC in Butlerville. Take it away, Jim and Alex.
Let's see. Can you see my screen? I need to switch. There you go. Okay. All right. So my name is Alex Helms. I work here at the Southeast Purdue Ag Center. In 2019, we started some potassium research trials here at the SEPAC location outside of North Vernon. And then in 2020, we expanded that research to 2 other farms, one outside of Muncie and one outside of Fort Wayne. They all have the same field history, which is no potassium fertilizer since 2002, with all other management practices being maintained. So what you end up with is high fertility with phosphorus, maintained pH, et cetera, except very low soil test potassium. I'm mostly going to talk about the SEPAC data, but I'm going to briefly talk about the DPAC, the Davis Purdue Ag Center outside of Muncie. So what you're seeing on the screen is their K-plot field, with the blue being the Glenwood soil type and the brown being the Pewamo soil type. Again, this field hasn't had potassium fertilizer in at least 2002, so almost a decade. And the Glenwood soil type, if you see in this top right corner, potassium ranges in the 2020 sampling from like 50 to 80 parts per million. And then in the bottom left, in the Pewamo, you have soil test ranges from 150 to 200. And again, this is with cropping practices. So you have 180 bushel or more corn and 60 bushel or better soybeans being removed on that Pewamo soil type, with the soil types being maintained at very high levels. So if you could imagine a place where variable rate fertilizer would fortunately, we don't have that kind of soil type here in Southeast Indiana. So when we don't apply potassium for, almost a decade, we get soil K levels down to about 25 parts per million. But like I said, all the other management practices were maintained. So we have relatively high phosphorus levels, with the organic matter pH and CEC sort of normal for the region. I'm going to mention briefly that these numbers are reported in the Malic-3 extractant, which your soil test that you would send off would be reported probably in the ammonium acetate or the Bray P1. So these are slightly higher than maybe what you would see. This 26 would maybe be about a 22 in your soil test. But the new tri-state moves to more of that Malic-3 reporting. So that's what we're going to report in here. So here at the SEPAC location, we had 2 fields that were almost identical, and we applied treatments in 2019 to one field. And then in 2020, we applied the same treatments in the other field, and then planted corn to the soybean field from 2019 as the residual plot. If the potassium number, 26 doesn't mean anything to you, the critical level at which you wouldn't expect a response from fertilizer is around 120 parts per million potassium. So we're extremely deficient potassium. So in 2019, it was pretty wet, so we didn't get it planted until about July 3rd. In 2020, we were much more timely. Got the soybeans planted in May of 2013, or sorry, May 13th of 2020. And the corn we planted the same day, but we had emergent failure, so we didn't get to replant until June 8th. The varieties were, you know, a 3.7 maturity and a 4.0 maturity, and a similar varieties for 2020 with a 3.6 maturity, and then the same 4.0 maturity that we had in 2019. And then the corn hybrids 1197 and 1464, which are pretty common pioneer hybrids for this area. Both years the potash was applied, you know, 3 or 4 weeks before planting, and both fields were no-tilled, so there was no incorporation of the potassium fertilizer after it was applied and before planting. So these are the two yield charts from 2019 and 2020. There was no difference between varieties in either year, so this data is just the two varieties added together, averaged together. Something interesting is that, you know, this 2019, we planted in July, so this is sort of double crop yields. And, you know, the 2020 is much more realistic of a full season soybean crop. However, both years, although drastically different yield, the same agronomic and economic optimum fertilizer rates were realized at 270 pounds per acre of potash for 2020 and 2019. The economic optimum, using $365 per ton for potash and $10 bushel soybeans, results in an economic optimum just less than the agronomic, you know, which if you look at that curve, the incremental benefit of adding potash declines as you become less deficient in potassium. So that's why your economic optimum is slightly less than your agronomic optimum. Something to note is, you know, if somebody is renting a new field, or, you know, just obtained the field through purchase and has a very low soil test, or maybe they don't think they're going to be able to farm it next year, they might say that, you know, I'm only going to put on the amount of potassium that the crop is going to use this year. So for example, if you were using the 2020 yield data and you fertilized for 75 bushel beans, you would have put on about 150 pounds of potash. However, if you see from this this trend line, or fertilizing at 150 pounds would have been about a 10 bushel reduction from the optimum rate. So what you would have had is about, you know, going from crop removal to the economic optimum, you would have spent an extra $20 in potash per acre, but you would have had a net gain in about $80 per acre by fertilizing this economic optimum versus just crop removal. So you're going to benefit the next person who farms it, but it also benefits you. Again, it was no-till, so you might be concerned about stratification of potash or potassium in the soil. But a 60 bushel bean crop takes up the equivalent of about 283 pounds of potash. So at this 75 bushel sort of maximum in 2020, that soybean would have accessed, you know, almost all of the potash that we applied to the field. So I don't think stratification of nutrients was an issue in either year. So it's important to be able to identify field deficiencies, potassium deficiency in the field. One method we tried using was remote sensing. We basically used a camera that was mounted on a drone, took a picture of the field, and then compared the plots using an index from the picture with the yield. And as you can see from both of these charts, 2019 and 2020, this visible atmospheric resistance index that we used was highly correlated to yield. Something that is important to note is that these low yielding plots here, you obviously could have picked up in the field those kind of symptoms just walking through the plot. However, these points here kind of towards the middle, although they were severely deficient as far as your optimum yield, you cannot have really seen the potassium deficiency symptoms out in the field. Now, we had the benefit in this trial of comparing, a high potash treatment to a very low potash, and we can tell that those moderately yielding plots were deficient in potassium. In a commercial field setting, if you had an index value of 0.3, it really wouldn't mean anything to you unless you had something to compare it to. So what some people do is they might apply a strip of double fertilizer, or they might skip a fertilizer pass so that they can have that sort of maximum or minimum greenness that they can compare the rest of the field to. So these are pictures from the 2020 plots. The top left is a 0K treatment. The top right is the 75-pound potash treatment. And then the middle is 150. So like I said, the 0 treatment, you can obviously tell walking through the field that it's severely deficient in potassium. The 75-pound treatment is a little bit different story. You might be able to see a little bit of deficiency in that bottom left corner of that picture, but if you walked through the plot, you really wouldn't be able to pick up on too many leaves that had that characteristic potassium deficiency. Now, the middle picture, that 150-pound rate, is 100 pounds less than the optimum, but honestly, walking through the plot, they look fantastic. That clipboard that I'm holding there is sitting on top of a yardstick, so those soybeans are over 3 foot tall, bushy. They're 30-inch rows, and they close the gap. So, if you were walking that field, you would say these soybeans look great, even though the optimum fertilizer rate was 100 pounds more than what is shown in this picture here. So another way to identify deficiency is through tissue testing. We tissue sampled in 2019 at the R3 growth stage. The tri-state threshold where you would expect a deficiency to occur is around 2%, which is on this x-axis here. There's the 2. And A&L Great Lakes, which is where we sent these samples, they say maybe slightly less at 1.7 as their threshold. What this data shows is, one, that those thresholds are probably fairly accurate, since our soybean yield tended to sort of max out around that 1.7 to 2% potassium tissue level. The other thing that this gives the potential for is testing maybe at an earlier growth stage at maybe V4 or V6. And if you receive a deficient tissue test, there's an opportunity for maybe a mid-season application of a potassium-containing fertilizer to maybe make up that difference in potassium deficiency. So lastly, the way you can sort of determine deficiency is through soil testing. Like I said earlier, we're severely deficient in soil, so we're not going to hit that critical level anytime soon. But if you are curious of how quick you can reach that sort of critical level of 120, what this research here has shown that it takes roughly 10 pounds of K2O per acre to change the soil test by 1. Now, some earlier research and other research shows that maybe that ratio is closer to maybe 8 pounds of K2O to change it by 1, but it's relatively close. So if you were to bring the soil test from 25 parts per million, which is where this field started, all the way up to the critical level of 120, our 300-pound treatment resulted in about a 13 parts per million increase in soil test. If you did that every year and you averaged 60 bushel an acre soybeans, you would take about 8 to 9 years to reach the critical level. But if you say that the economic optimum is 250 and you're going to fertilize that and you average 60 bushel beans, it's going to take about 12 to 16 years to reach that critical level, that soil critical level. So something to maybe take home from that is that if you take over a field and your landlord wants to see your potassium levels increase, you might show them something like this and say that it does take time for soil potassium levels to significantly increase or decrease. It won't be a one-year job. So I'm going to briefly talk about the corn we had, which was in the residual plot. So the left chart here was the residual plots where we applied the potash treatments to the soybeans in 2019 and then just planted the corn in 2020 with no fertilizer. The chart here on the right was we had the potash treatments in the soybeans in 2019 plus the same treatment in 2020 before the corn planting. Something to note is that there was no difference in response between hybrids at the optimum level. However, at low soil test potassium, the Pioneer 1197 hybrid accessed more potassium than the 1464. So you don't hope to ever be in a situation where you're deficient in potassium, but if that is the case, the hybrid that you use could respond differently. The agronomic optimum for the fertilized plots were around 230 pounds an acre, and that was just below a yield of 250 bushel an acre. Again, the economic optimum was slightly less at about 223 pounds. The tri-state fertilizer recommendations would have recommended about 260 pounds per acre. So this research shows that the optimum was actually slightly less than maybe what the tri-state would have recommended. And then I just wanted to emphasize again that the corn visual symptoms was pretty much the same story as the soybeans. So the zero treatment is the corn stalk off on the far right. And then the second from the right is the 75-pound treatment all the way up to the 300-pound potash treatment on the far left. Walking through that 0K plot, you can obviously tell that it is deficient in potassium. It barely puts on an ear. But then you start walking through the 75-pound treatment. If you have something to compare it to, you could say that, yes, it was deficient. But if you're walking through that, cornfield, and that's the only thing you have to compare it to, it would be very, very difficult to identify the potassium deficiency. So again, it is important to tissue test or use some sort of method to identify if your field is actually limiting in potassium. So just to summarize what I sort of rushed through there is fertilizing for crop removal at the low soil K cannot achieve your optimum yield. So if you inherit ground that is very low, it is insufficient to only apply what you're going to take off. Visual symptoms were not a sufficient indicator of nutrient deficiency. So it's important to soil test or tissue test because you're not going to be able to see the deficiency. And if you do, you are extremely deficient. And then lastly, the residual fertilizer in the corn was insufficient for optimum yields in fields testing very low for K. So if you do inherit a field that is very low in potassium, it would be a good strategy to fertilize every year versus trying to fertilize every other year. And then, of course, we need to thank the people who are funding the research. So Nutrien directly is funding a lot of the samples A&L, Great Lakes, and SureTech are supporting this research through reduced testing costs. Purdue pesticide programs provided some funds for some sampling, and Corteva Ag helped us harvest the plots this year. So I think Jim is going to talk a little bit about the new tri-state fertilizer recommendations.
Hey, Dr. Camerato, are you there? Alex, while we have a minute, maybe to figure out some audio difficulties with Dr. Camerato, could you answer the question in the chat? Someone asked, how would strip till with dry fertilizer change your results?
How would dry fertilizer with strip till change the results? I'm not sure it would change the results all that much because I guess if you're expecting the banding to help the plant access the potassium easier or have access to more of the potassium, I don't think that really occurred because as I kind of said, you know, a 60 bushel per acre corn soybean crop required like an equivalent of 283 pounds of potash. So at that 75 pound or 75 bushel per acre yield in 2020, that soybean crop had to have been accessing almost all of the fertilizer that was applied. So I guess, yeah, if your question is by, you know, banding the nutrient, you know, giving the plant more access to it, I don't think it would have changed the results in this scenario that much, I guess. I guess I also saw, so is potash mobile? I guess if I have time, I can maybe answer that a little bit. So it is slightly mobile in the soil, but if you think about this scenario that I'm talking about, it's a no-till field, so most of the potassium is only going to leach into the maybe top couple inches of the soil, but you know, some 80% of your root mass is also going to be up in that very top layer of the soil profile. So you know, although there will be significant stratification of the nutrient, it's going to be stratified in an area where the roots are also stratified.
Thanks, Alex. Dr. Camerato, can you hear us now? We're having some audio difficulties. Looks like you're there.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear. Go ahead.
Is my screen being shared or?
Right now, we just see you on the screen. You should have sharing capabilities if you'll try that again.
Let's see. Nah, I don't see the share. Can you just put up my slides?
Yes, 1 second. If you go ahead and introduce it, I'll get it pulled up for you.
So I'm going to follow up a little bit on what Alex talked about and to present the updated tri-state fertilizer recommendations and the changes that are specific to potassium. The update came out just a week or two ago, and it's available there. Yeah, there it is. It's available at that website. You can download a PDF copy. It's a little cumbersome of a download. They have to send you an email. So they're obviously tracking who gets it, but it's free. or if you want a paper copy, you can order one from that same address, and it's only $9 a copy. So that's pretty good for a pretty big bulletin like this. And it's a joint effort of Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, as it was back in '95 when the last version was published. Alex mentioned, yeah, next slide, please, John. Yeah, Alex mentioned that we'll be reporting in Malic 3 instead of ammonium acetate for potassium, and that's the soil test method. And some laboratories have been using that method for 20 plus years and converting from the Malic 3 back to the ammonium acetate. And so we decided, since the larger labs, the predominance of the samples are done with the Malic 3, that we would write the recommendations in Malic 3. And they don't change a whole lot with potassium. The old number times 1.14 would equal the new number. And both methods are excellent at making, or they're as good as each other as making fertilizer recommendations. We simplified it back again. We simplified it a little. Before, you had a different critical level or maintenance range for every cation exchange capacity. And now we just have one for sandy soils or CECs less than 5, and another maintenance range for CECs greater than 5. And so you don't have to know what this critical level is at 5 milliequivalents and 6 and 7 and 8 and 10 and 15 and 20. You just have these two ranges to remember. Next slide, please. Alex talked a little bit about how recommendations are made, in that when soil test is really low, we make a high fertilizer recommendation, and that's called the build-up phase. And we recommended fertilizer to maximize the yield of the crop, fully replace crop removal, and then some extra each year for 4 years in order to build the soil up into the maintenance range or the optimal level. And that's a pretty conservative approach, and was designed when people owned the land or had long-term leases. And having a moderate soil test level gives one the flexibility of skipping a fertilizer application when needed because of price or access to the field, without losing yield and profit due to that lost yield. And then the maintenance region for potassium would be replacing crop removal plus about 20 pounds of potassium per acre. And that 20 pounds extra compensates for the leaching loss of some potassium in low cation exchange soils and the fixation of potassium in some of the heavier clay soils. And then the third region of this or phase of this philosophy is the drawdown phase, where we recommended less than crop removal at higher soil test levels to gradually let the soil test level fall into the maintenance range. And that was because people didn't sample all that frequently, and they sampled fields pretty coarsely. A single sample represented a large acreage. And that's not true today. We have much more intensive sampling, more frequent sampling, and probably more accurate sampling and analysis. So next slide, please. Well, in the next slide, it shows that that drawdown range has been removed. Yeah. And so the recommendation goes to 0 at the upper limit of the maintenance range. And those are two numbers up there represent that critical level and the maintenance limit. And it should be for a soil with a CEC of more than 5, the critical level should be 140 parts per million, not 100. And then the upper level is 170 parts per million. Next slide, please. One of the things that has changed quite a bit for potassium is the amount of potassium removed in the grain. Thousands of samples have shown that for all three crops, corn, soybeans, and wheat, the amount of potassium per bushel of grain removed from the field is anywhere from about 20 to 30% lower than it was in our old recommendations. So even though yields have increased, the amount of potassium removed from the field has not increased as much because the concentration in the grain is actually less. Next slide. This just shows what the recommendations would be if one was in the maintenance range in the optimum soil test levels and for corn and soybeans. And I highlighted there on top the new recommendations in the old. And you see for any given yield, the amount removed is only about 10 or less than 15 pounds of K2O per acre less now than it was due to that lower concentration. Next slide. Well, that's just a quick overview. If you want more detail, please download this publication. If you have any questions, please email me. And at the CCA conference this year, well, not at the crop management workshop in January, we'll be talking about all of the important changes in the tri-state fertilizer recommendations. If you want to attend that meeting, we'll get into the phosphorus and nitrogen changes as well. So thank you, John. And I'll hand it back to you.
Dr. Camberado, thank you so much. We do have one quick question for you while we have just a little bit of time. We're just a little bit over. We had a question about the updated recommendations. Will those be incorporated into A&L software, A&L Great Lakes, their software for testing?
Yeah, you would have to ask them. I believe they will be. That was our anticipation for that.
Thank you again so much, Dr. Camberado. Let's keep moving on with our program today. We will have a soybean update now with Dr. Sean Castile. Sean, looks like you're there. Go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thank you, John. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
All right, good. Let's see if I can share a screen. And good to go there too, John?
You look great, Sean. Take it away.
Okay. Thanks so much. Appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you guys today, and great turnout. They asked me to talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing, update on soybean management, and I'm going to concentrate tonight on some of the UAV, UAS work that we've done over the years. And SEPAC has been definitely one of our sites that has been in that role. It's been pretty much our standard seeding rate trials, and then we've kind of morphed them a little bit to include the UAV in this. And so want to make sure that I'm trying to do a couple things on the side here. There we go. Make sure that I have Richard Smith as the PhD student that's on this project, and as Malene Leffert, and then Alex and Joel down at Southeast Farm, as well as the other PACs have been a major part of that. And so we're going to kind of give an update of what we've been doing, how we've been processing this, and see if we get a little direction. All right, let's get that advancing. So, I mean, UAV's nothing new in terms of the last couple of years. I think most of us have had an appreciation for the casual scouting and what it can do for us. You know, a case in this point of, you know, just going up and getting the bird's eye view and catching tire compaction, very systematic tire compaction from, this happened to be a planter on soybeans. And so you see that pattern, and you can walk that and figure that out. And then even, you know, look at corn, soybean, pore stands coming into play. Again, this casual scouting, spot infill. So that's certainly something that's neat, but we want to be able to move it to a point where can we use it as a management tool on some of these replants. And so that's a big part of this. And so here's a case. Let's see if I can get the laser pointer going. laser pointer, again, this is a field that you've flown, and you set up a pattern. So then you're catching 200, 300 images, whatever it is, and overlaying those, and you get this orthomosaic. And so catching the drowned out spots on the regular digital picture off to the left, and then off to the right, using the red and green and blue bands to create a vegetative indice. A lot of us are familiar with the NDVI. This happened to be the Vary, and so it's using a regular digital camera's color bands, red, green, and blue, to create this, whereas in NDVI is using more from the multi-spec and those bands. And so trying to do a lower cost version of this and moving forward. And so on soybeans, it's no surprise when you think about early detection on soybeans and whether we're to do a replant or not. Need to be out there on the early side. I think most of us have an appreciation for timely planted beans. Down that neck of the woods, down in the southeast, those crawdad soils, I mean, it's hard to get out timely. And so even some of the timely plantings of general state level, maybe not the best, because those soils tend to be a little wetter, hold on to them longer. But even still, having late planted in well into June, late June, mid-Junes can wreak havoc on good yielding beans. And so that kind of comes into this case of how are we taking soybean stands, and how accurately are we doing that, and how fast are we going across the field. So in this case, I've got the two standard versions that we've had for years and decades, really, is go out, take the hula hoop, and count the number of plants in there and just upscale it. So in this case, you have a 32-inch diameter hula hoop, and you're counting 10 plants that equals 78,000 plants. And then again, are you representing that field? I mean, that's a small area. Similar vein, I've gone to the linear method just so I can have a tape measure on my hip and measuring out 21 inches of two 15-inch rows, and that's 1/10,000th of an acre. I double that and count twice as much to do one stand count. And so if I'm counting 24 plants in that area, divided by 2, and then I've got a stand of 120,000 plants. So this is how we've done it, just again, boots on the ground, literally counting these plants. But the critical part of this is when we're doing it, and then to be able to cross the field in a fashion that you represent it. And so, we're talking about VE to just when the cotyledons and the unifoliates, the cotyledons are out, and we go to VC when the cotyledons and unifoliates are fully expanded. And those are pretty young plants. Let's see. Then to the point of V2, a lot of us over the years have made the call of doing stand counts around V2, all the plants are up, hoping we got a good stand. But if we are subpar, let's say, and that's subpar for me in our research over the years, is if we're around 70,000 plants, oh, there we go. Nothing like that moving around. Not sure if you can see me as the laptop fell down, but let me get it reset. There we go. I don't know whether you can see me or not. I'll just assume you got some version of me. And so with that, the idea is we're going to have V2, hoping you got a good stand. Well, at that point, if we're going to do replant, we've really lost out on the opportunity to do a proper timing. And so want to get out there early. And here's my point of doing that early, to make sure that we're catching the proper growth stage and timing. This is a study that was done before my time, but it was a neat study looking at timing of this replant, and then the scenario of how much yield is lost or not. And in this one, let me get the laser pointer back. So in this study, supplemental planting was at V2, and the plants were originally 2 trifoliates, and initial stand 200,000, 58 bushel beans, no problem. Let's go on down to, it's got 132,000 stand, and they said that wasn't good enough. We want to go over the top. So we'll get 48 bushels from the original, and then another 5.5 bushels from that additional. But the overall yield level is really no different, 53, 55 bushel. Let's go on down to that gray area I talked about, 66, 67, 80, 70,000 plants. Yield level is 50, not nearly as good as our original stand of, again, 57, 58 bushel. But if we're going into overseed in this case, 130,000, 132,000, we'll get 41 bushel from the original stand. those plants have already made the decision to branch by this point V2 and to compensate for that open area. But in this case, we've overseeded it and gained 10.5 bushel, but we've lost basically 10 bushel by that mechanical damage. And so we're no better off at the V2 with this 66,000 stand. And certainly if we want to just jump off the cliff, till it all up and do a high seeding rate because the later planting, yield level wasn't there. All that's to be said that V2 really is too late, and here's the whys. And again, that 70,000-ish gray is a gray area. We had another study when I first started that we looked at the timing of delay and really trying to catch the best time. And so I just kind of made the point that V2 is probably not the best. And so we had an original stand where we had 50,000. So I'll use this schematic here where the black, solid black is 50,000 every 15 inches. And then we interseeded with another 50,000 in the gold lines in between. So the overall stand's 100,000. But we decide whether we did it at no delay, same day of planting, or we are looking at the VC. So when the original plants were at VC, so codlings and unifoliates fully expanded, to when the original plants were V2, original plants were V4. And so at this point, pictures taken into June, the original plants were V7. You can see kind of the shading that comes into play. Let's go. Then by the end of the season, near the end of the season, what does this really look like? And so original stand, no delay, and the relay or the interplanting. And so they have that same kind of branching, decent pod load, 50-50 on what they're providing to the overall yield. VC, at this point, again, setting the point of when we need to be out there making this call, VC. So when the plants are codlings, the unifoliates fully expand. So we're talking, a couple inches here. The original stand was 50,000, branched up. It's already made that decision. I make that very clear that it's already decided to start branching by that point because the light quality around it. Then we interseeded, and then you have plant that's contributing a little bit, but they're not branching. And when it comes to the end of the day in the yield, that delayed planted one is maybe on the order of 10 to 15% of the overall yield, whereas the remaining 80% is from that original stand. And then if we go to when it's V2, the original plant was V2, we have maybe 5%, 7% coming from that replant. So again, just trying to make the point of this decision has to be made early if we're going to do any replanting to gain that advantage. And then as we jump off the cliff at V4, certainly we don't get anything at the tail end of the season, we just get the twig. And then here's a case of if the original stand was 100,000 plus another 100,000, certainly we shouldn't have any issue with 200,000 plants. But what you will see is that the contribution is much less. So we have greater shading with 100,000 original plus 100,000, and certainly by the V2 scenario, we've got original plants that are doing 100%, and then the replant is contributing nothing. It's a twig at that point. The good thing out of those is that they never become a weed in that regard. So now moving all that forward to our UAV work and really trying to do all that work up front. So VE, VC, V1, that's the point. And we flew these fields all season long, and Richard did, I should say. So let's get into those. All right. So we want to address the spatial variability, and I want to get out there and do it in a timely fashion. So what's the ability of these UAS and this UAV system to assess the stands and plant populations and growth stage? And then to figure out a process, how do we get there? Is it just images? Do we use vegetative indices? And on the onset of this, my approach was not to count plants, but to look at canopy. I think the idea of trying to count soybean plants to their structure, I just don't think that's worth it. I think that we gain more with the ability to harvest sunlight. And so that's been my take, is to look at a canopy coverage more so than an actual plant stand. So my goal in a way is to say, what's the critical canopy cover at VC, at V1, V2, rather than optimal plant stand. So they're the traditional field scale trials where we go from 50 to 250,000 seeding rate. Right, and in this case, we did 2 different cultivars across the PAC system, And I'm just going to highlight a few of these trials that we've done over the last couple of years. 2 cultivars that have different structure, again, trying to think through if there's different architecture in the way that plant grows, leaf shape, those kind of things. And then 3 to 5 replications per pack. And so here's a case of this one of the Southeast farms fields. And so, this just happens to be one of our older ones where we did 5 senior eighths and then repped across that field. Okay. So field scale trials we did all the way from up in the northeast farm, go down to Davis, southeast, and then we caught the western side as well as Penny, the agronomy farm, and Meigs right south of Lafayette. Today we'll talk a little bit about some of the results from 2019 and 2020. Looking at the 2019 season, just making the comment that it was a late planted year, and so that comes into play. We had 2 conventional tillage systems, whereas you would imagine that the ground cover, so residue, would have an issue on the way that this processing occurs versus no-till. And again, the pairing of varieties for the locations. In 2020, what we've been able to get across in time for today's talk is just a few of the locations from Penny, Davis, and the Southeast farm. Okay. Did a lot of different measurements, and so in the course of 12 more minutes here, I'll kind of get through again the idea of canopy coverage, vegetative indices, and then some of the terrain attributes in the way that we look at where water accumulates and putting weather into this. We use the DJI Matrice platform. So this is higher end, but it allows us to swap in and out different cameras, and that's what we're doing there. Let me try to let someone in the room. Automatic, here we go. All right, and then with this can simply be turned over into the Phantom 4s and so forth, so that the concept's still the same. So we've got these transitions, and then trying to select the best path. And so in this, catching equal variability. So we did transects across this. So we've got the trial planted left to right, and then we did transects of low altitude flights going across, as well as plant stands. And so within that, stepping across this field and laying clay pigeons down to mark those and to be able to go directly back to that point, have ground control points, and to reference that exact area. And so the crew would go out, let me get the laser back, go out and then put a 10-foot by 10-foot PVC structure, count the plants, and then we have the ground control of this as well as moving across with the imagery. Low altitude flights were a part of this, as well as the high altitude. High altitude is where we want to be, because that's where you're going to cover a lot of ground literally in a fast fashion. The low altitudes is to be another level of ground truth. So with that, low altitude in this case was 30 foot above the field, and again, very, very nice precision. And then high altitude that we settled in on was 250 foot altitude with 75% overlap in the front and then the side. To do this kind of work, you need the ground control points as we've laid out here. So then every image, especially when you do a orthomosaic, can be pieced together and then brought back to where they need to be every single time, because you're doing multiple flights across this field, and you want to make sure that you can get across it. So we'll go through a few of those time series. This happens to be up in the Northeast farm. And this was the 250 foot altitude. Again, 75% front overlap, side overlap, stitch all these images together with the trowel underneath of it. And so, believe it or not, this field has V1 soybeans. So this is when you have one trifoliate fully expanded. And you're thinking, how in the world? There's no way. And this is the same thing that we're trying to figure out on the ground, walking that field. Where do you look? Is there even plants there? This is a no-till field. You go to V3, you can start to see some of this stripe out a little bit at the higher rates, higher seeding rates, okay? And then certainly as we get to R1 and move on down the rest of the season, as we get canopied, we want to be green to the eye by the 4th of July, so go back to that R1. And so we certainly have varieties that are that way. But thinking through that, we want to be able to, at V1, if not even earlier, to make a decision of a replant. And so by my naked eye, I'm like, there's no way but that's the beauty of running some of this through the computer and doing some of the binary threshold that I'm about to share that Richard and others have gotten into. All right, and so let's kind of zoom in on this where we've got the overall 250-foot altitude flight, and then Richard's pulled this out, and so we've split it. So off to the left here, you've got what the image would look like when it's stitched together at 250-foot altitude, and then you've got these transects. We did 2 per field, right? These low altitude transects, so it's the 30-foot altitude, very low, and you could even see rowing these individual plants. Okay, that's at V1. Again, if you did a drive-by, you could probably even row those, but at the higher altitude, not as much. And then each one of these plots, again, are ground controlled. They've got you can even see it in this image, I'll put the dot over it, the clay pigeon to go back to it every single time and look at different populations. So in doing this, I come up with a method to quantify how many green pixels, so basically the area of plants versus a ground area, and then using that to assess, do we have an adequate stand or not. So in the initial stages of this, we're doing the rate response. So seed rate response, get the canopy or rate response and get the yield at the end of the season, and then to calculate what was optimal plant population, all right? And then go back in time, looking at the images at the growth stages of those plots and get what the canopy was. And so then over the course of these years, come up with what's a percent canopy cover that we need by VC based on how that plant performed with yield at the end of the season. So we have to do some of this post-mortem to figure it out, but that's the process. And getting to that, and we have the regular digital picture, and then we come into these bands and create a vegetative indices. So this one, I think he's done a number of different ones, so from the berry to the green leaf index, GLI, and others like that. And then to get into binary, yes or no. So with this, the yeses being it has the green pixels that have been converted to white pixels, and then everything else is converted to black. So it's easy to count yes, no's, and do what the proportion of canopy cover is. So plant pixels versus all, get the percentage, okay? And so this is just a time series with one image to get the point across. This one's V1, all right? And that's what the original picture looked like. You come in and they do the vegetative indice, all right? And then do the binary threshold. And so the canopy on this picture was 8%. Go to V3, obviously more plant area, more growth, more leaf area, and then go through that same stepwise process of creating a vegetative indice to make it easier to do the yes, no's, and then come into a canopy coverage of 21%. V5, R1, and then by R1, again, we want to be green to the eye by 4th of July. Usually that's by the time we're flowering. Out the top, R1 to R2, 97%. So that concept should kind of make sense that you can see how much that canopy is being covered. We're just using the computer to populate what that is instead of estimating it ourselves. So in the last 5 minutes or so, I'll go through some of the various indices we've looked at. The low altitude, again, that 30-foot altitude versus the high altitude, where that's the whole field. We have the growth stage at VC, V1, V3, and to the end of the season. And what I want to concentrate on is these are R-squares, so the correlations of how well are these indices predicting the plant population. That's what we've looked at with this. So the dotted line is one that I always want you to look at. That's our canopy coverage. All right. The GLI is the indice that seems to be pulling out fairly well for us. And so that's using just red, green, blue bands, so a regular digital camera. And then one that's a little more mainstream in terms of a digital camera setup is Vary, so that's going to be of the orange. And just to have that as a concept of, it's probably not performing as well for this express purpose, whereas the canopy coverage and the GLI seem to be doing much better. So with this, laying that out, this is up at Penny in 2020. Canopy coverage as early as VC, this is low altitude, 30-foot altitude, 0.8, 0.9, very good, and they maintain the ability to look at canopy coverage and predicting what the plant population would be, okay, V1, V3. GLI, that's the indice that we're starting to see a little more promise. maybe not as high, 0.6 or so, and the very nowhere near it. Now let's go down to the high altitude, which is where we want to be, because high altitude we can do a field in 20 minutes, whereas at low altitude there's no way we can do this in a feasible manner. And so with that, on the first set here at the 2020 Penny location, GLI, VC, that's kind of on the early side. By the time we're coming into V1, upwards of 0.8. So that's starting to show some fairly good promise of predicting what the plant population is with. We got both dotted line, the canopy coverage, as well as the GLI. If you go back to the image, I did a time series of that whole field. That V1, you would not even be able to look at that, right? Our naked eye, we couldn't pull that apart, whereas we're able to do this with the software and to work through that. So that's at Penny. Southeast Farm. So in 2020, the stands were very, very low. And so that's where I think this breaks off a little bit at this high altitude, because we had stands that were sub 10,000 plants per acre. So I think it went from 5 to 125,000. So I think that's just fallen off the cliff, so to speak. Whereas if we're closer to having like a 50,000 and upwards, and that's probably where I'll have Richard to look at this data set again, I think we're going to see more promise for the high altitude and the GLI, as well as maybe the canopy coverage. And Davis Farm in 2020 looked very good in terms of predicting. I'll go back to the 30-foot altitude and predicting the plant population with canopy coverage. When we look at the GLI by V1, it's looking really good as well. Come down to where, they think about a crop consultant, think about a farmer going across the field, an extension educator, do the whole field. By the time we're coming to V1, we have some pretty good correlations with what the plant population is with the GLI as well as the canopy coverage. So that's some very promising results in that way. So then we can use this as a tool to make that replant decision and not be too late. What I mean by being too late, again, is that V2 or later, I just don't think that we're making the decision or replanting at the proper time. We need to be between this VC to V1 is the point that we need to be making that call across that whole field. So with that, I know we didn't have much time to get into a lot of the details, but I think that there is some possibilities as we move forward with this. I think that the idea of using a canopy coverage is one that shows a lot of promise. It's very accurate and correlates very well at the early stages. So even at VC, I think we see some really good correlations. The GLI is another one, especially whenever we put it in a higher altitude with what would be a standard flight pattern. What I want to leave you with is using some of the 2019 data. Haven't gotten into 2020 yet, but based on our 2019 data across most of the packs by VC, if we had VC to V1, if we had a canopy coverage of 4%, which again sounds crazy, but 4% canopy coverage that or higher, we optimize yield and we didn't need to do anything else. So again, you go back to the picture where you couldn't see it and I couldn't see it. If we calculated 4% canopy, we were well within the realms of optimal. And then by the time we went to V1, V2, we were closer to 15%, 15 to 20% canopy coverage. We didn't need to make a decision. So again, I think that we're starting to peel this apart to have some of those opportunities for making a decision in that way. So with that, I'd like to thank the support of Richard and his project, the Wabash Heartland Innovation Network. I also want to thank all the PACs for all their work in terms of planting the trials, helping us, maybe even having a few flights for us. We appreciate that. And Richard's the one to really thank. He's the PhD student that's been one grinding on this, doing the flights, catching the days without the popcorn clouds, and then processing, and then just going back and forth. So with that, I would be happy to entertain any questions in the minute or so I've got left.
Sean, thank you so much. Great presentation here. We have one question. What is GLI?
Green leaf index. And I'd have to go back to look at it's using the red, green, and blue bands from a regular digital camera, but it's just the equation. And I may even, let's see, I may even have it in here. If I go back quick enough, because I haven't got that one memorized myself. Well, I thought, do the whole presentation, you want to see it. Well, it must have been one I took out. So green leaf index, and again, it's using the red, green, blue, just in a different proportion.
Perfect. Sean, thank you again. We are going to move on to our next presentation. You can see Sean's email there on the screen. As always, we encourage our soybean farmers to reach out to him. There is probably no more respected specialist in the state concerning soybean production. Thank you again, Sean. Let's go ahead and move on. Our next presenter covering our topic of crop disease and response to foliar fungicides will be Dr. Darcy Talenko. Darcy, take it away.
Okay, I think you can hear me, right? And
You sound great. And we can see your screen.
you can see the PowerPoint?
Looks great.
We're good to go. Okay. Well, we're almost through the program tonight, so we'll try to liven it up a little bit with a little talk on field crop diseases. As always, as the field crop pathologist, I want to just discuss the disease triangle and what we need to be watching for when we worry about diseases, and then talk a little bit about what we've seen using different fungicide programs across the state and some of those diseases that we're monitoring. So the first thing when we talk about diseases, then we need to have three factors occurring in a field in order to have a disease issue occur. And the first is do we have a susceptible host? So those are the corn or soybean planted in that field. And then second is that pathogen present. So a lot of our pathogens we're looking at, gray leaf spot, frog eye leaf spot in soybeans, is the pathogen present? Has that field had a history of that? Are we building up inoculum? Those that are already here, they're overwintering and they're already present. So then the biggest factor of whether we'll see a disease in a season is that environment. And many of our fungal pathogens really require water and moisture conditions and certain temperature conditions to occur. So if that favorable environment is there, we'll see a lot of disease develop. But say we go hot and dry, and we had many areas this year that were dry this season, that is less favorable for many of our fungal pathogens for their spores to germinate and infect the plant, therefore reducing that disease risk for a field. And so, if we get the favorable environments like we saw in 2018, we had a lot of moisture, we saw a lot of frog eye leaf spot move in. Those are the conditions that are really going to promote some of those diseases that are overwintering and here on an annual basis. And then when we turn, when we're trying to manage diseases, there are four main areas we can look at. First, can we find a hybrid or variety that has genetic resistance that's acting on that host part of the triangle? Will crop rotation help reduce some of that inoculum that's surviving year to year? Again, acting on the host and pathogen of the triangle. We can use sanitation, either by tillage. If we can till the field, we can bury some of the inoculum, reducing the number that's available. And then also think about some of our soil-borne pathogens. We may be able to move them with machinery between fields. So it's important to understand where the pathogen is surviving and how we might be able to manage that field to try to reduce the disease. And then finally, make a decision of whether a pesticide or a fungicide is going to be useful. Again, all of these management tactics are acting on the host or the pathogen side of that triangle. The one thing we cannot control is that environmental conditions, and that really is what's going to dictate year to year what pathogens are going to be present. So I just thought I'd talk about a few of the major diseases we watch here in Indiana for corn and soybeans. So the main one I think about is gray leaf spot. This disease is found throughout the state. It's surviving in the soil year to year, and we call it a bottom-up disease. So when we're starting to scout and look for this disease to try to make a decision if we want to apply a fungicide, we need to look at that lower crop canopy. Are we starting to see those classic symptoms of frog eye leaf spot, the angular, or gray leaf spot, the angular lesions forming on those lower leaves? Is it starting to move up in the crop canopy with the goal that if we want to put out a fungicide, the idea is we want to protect that ear leaf and above so we can get the optimum yield from that crop. Another disease we may be watching for is northern corn leaf blight. This disease may be found throughout the crop canopy as those spores move a little higher within that crop canopy when they sporulate. A third disease that we watch here in Indiana is southern corn rust. This disease we track nationally. This one does not overwinter in Indiana, so every year we start fresh and we monitor its movement from the south, Georgia, Alabama. Is it moving up? Will it be moved here in Indiana early enough to cause impact? This disease, we do need samples to confirm it, to distinguish the two different spore types from our common rust and the southern rust. Again, the southern rust is what could cause significant yield impacts and does impact corn production in the south. And finally, the fourth disease that generally we're starting to see here in Indiana that's gotten a lot of PR press in the last few years is tar spot. And at the end, I'm going to show you what we've learned so far about this disease, where I think the risks are within the state, and what we've learned on how the best management practices for this disease. But again, these are the 4 foliar diseases I think here in Indiana we monitor and watch to try to make a decision on using a fungicide. There are 10, 15 more other diseases we can run across, but many of those aren't going to be controlled by using fungicides. If we look at soybeans, I think our biggest concern if we're going to make a foliar application for controlling disease is frog eye leaf spot. If you have a susceptible variety, you need to be scouting early R1 to be looking to see if you can find any of these lesions in the crop canopy. That will guide your decision on whether a fungicide would be needed to try to manage this disease. A few other diseases that may be out there in the crop canopy include Cercospora leaf blight, same genus as the frog eye leaf spot, but this one causes the purple bronzing of that upper leaves and can lead to that purple seed stain we saw a lot of in 2018. And another common disease we quite frequently see is Septoria brown spot. This disease is in the lower canopy. Generally, we don't worry about it impacting yield, but it is present and has the potential, if the conditions are conducive, to move up in the crop canopy as well. So we're looking for these diseases, scouting and trying to make an informed decision, and then trying to understand what the best timing for our fungicides should be. So here's just a general diagram of the optimum timing that has been determined for using fungicides both in corn and soybeans. So we're scouting late vegetative stages in corn to try to make that decision to spray at the VTR1, especially for gray leaf spot in corn. And then soybeans, we're scouting R1 to R2, looking for frog eye to make a decision to spray at R3. So if the disease is present in the crop canopy, we make a decision, we make a fungicide application. Generally, our fungicides are going to provide us 2 to 3 weeks of residual protection within the crop canopy. And so the idea is we want to lay that fungicide down when the canopy is most at risk for the disease to cause yield impacts. Maybe in another field, the diseases didn't move in quite so early, but you see some moving in later. They may get sprayed a couple weeks beyond that VTR1. That fungicide application would then extend that fungicide further out into the season, maybe getting you a little closer to reaching maturity at R5 and R6. And maybe we don't see much disease. Soybeans were relatively quiet this season, and we don't really need to make a fungicide application if the disease has moved in late. At the season, the diseases aren't going to multiply and cause enough damage to see significant yield impacts. And then, you want to think about your return on investment on using a fungicide. So again, the idea is we want to spray those fungicides when we know the diseases may be moving up into those crop canopies and can impact the yield of those various crops. Some work that's been done on looking at gray leaf spot, and I think this is can be useful for all the other diseases that we talk about, is how much of that ear leaf is affected by the disease. If we can keep 5% or less, we're really not going to see any yield losses occur in the field. When we see 6 to 25% of that ear leaf being lost, we could potentially lose up to 10% of the yield. And as that disease progresses, if we lose that ear leaf or above, we may see up to 50% yield loss. So our idea is we really want to protect that upper canopy, keep the disease at a minimum, and try to just make a decision on when the best to spray those fungicides when they're needed, and not spraying them. Maybe it's not necessary to spray them if they're not needed. And the other thing to think about is your return on investment. So this is just looking at corn. Again, if a $3 to $4 corn, the idea is we want to, if we put a fungicide out, we need about 5 to 11 bushels per acre protected to return that investment on adding that fungicide cost. And looking at that, if you then decide you want to make a fungicide application, there's 3 resources that are available. These, the efficacy tables that we put together, they're from the data throughout the United States, evaluating the mode of actions of all the different fungicide groups for the various diseases that we see in corn, soybean, and wheat. So these tables are available. We'll be updating them again in February. as we continue to get more information on the various new modes of action that are out there. And this is just an example of one of those tables. So this is the one I took from last year in the corn diseases. So the common diseases that we do use fungicides to control, like common rust, eye spot, gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight. We did add a tar spot column. This generally showed those fungicides that had a label. Generally, those that had a label had a good to very good rating. So the idea is you can use this table, look up some of your fungicide groups, and try to cross-reference them to see how effective they are in the various diseases. So here's just an example. Proconazole Tilt is a trade name. It gets about a good rating for gray leaf spot, but if you look at Trivapro with a 3-way mix, it has an excellent rating. So these tables can be very useful to try to identify products that you may want to use. If you're looking at generics, you can cross-reference the active ingredients and try to determine what active ingredients are most effective for the various diseases. So these are available both for corn, soybean, and wheat if you're looking. And so then the next question is, how often do we get a yield benefit with putting a fungicide out in corn and in soybeans? Recently, they did a number of meta-analysis of a number of trials conducted in 12 states in Ontario from 2014 to 2015, looking at putting out a fungicide no matter what the disease pressure was and what is the resulting yield increase. So they looked at 2 different fungicide classes. They looked at the QOIs and then the DMIs plus the QOIs, and then 3 different timings. So a V6 plus VT, so we were hitting that field twice with a fungicide application, V6 alone, and then VT. So they, compiled all these data from all the different states and tried to look at overall what was the yield increase. So if you can see here, overall for the QOIs, the double hit with the V6 plus VT had about a 3.8% yield increase. And then the DMI, the 2 modes of action, had about a 4% increase with the V6 plus VT application timing, so a hit twice in the field. But you can see that optimum, that VT that we talk about, that one alone just had a 3.6% yield increase. So again, it's the VT timing, especially if we have diseases occurring, that is the big one that helps protect yield at the end of the season. So then they went and they separated out the data. So this is just looking at the frequency of positive yield responses at the various application timings. This is looking at that double mode of action, the DMI plus the strobilurin. And as you can see at the V6 application, about 70% of the time, they had a positive yield response when a fungicide was added as compared to a non-treated. And that averaged about 2.97 bushels per acre. So that still doesn't really get us to the return on investment if we look at the yields we need to protect in order to pay for that fungicide. If we look at the VT application, about 73% of the time there was a positive positive yield benefit, with that mean being about 7.2. So here, yes, you can see that that VT application timing is more ideal than an earlier application at V6. Again, the V6 would have run out of steam by the time many of our pathogens are active later in the season. And then looking at that combination of V6 plus VT, about 75% of the time there was a positive yield response with about 8 bushels per acre. So again, if you added the cost of having 2 applications of fungicide out there, it's probably not getting you that return on investment versus a 1 good well-timed VT application in the middle of the season. If we look at that breaking even across the United States, here's looking at the different values of corn. So $2 to $3, $4, and $5 bushel corn. You can see that if our fungicides on average are $20 to $25 an acre, we get a return on our cost about 42 to 62% of the time. And this is just looking at that VT application. So that just gives you an idea. If you're just going to decide to spray fungicides no matter what disease is active, this is about the chances you'll get a return on putting that fungicide out there. If you look at the combination of the V6 plus VT, so again, we've bumped our fungicide costs up. So now we're at $35 to $45 an acre. The chance of recovering your costs is about 15 to 45%. So again, we've lowered our chances in getting a recovery on adding that fungicide if we're just going to spray both times and no regards to the diseases that are occurring in the field. We recently just published the meta-analysis looking at this at the soybean side of things. So this data is from 240 field trials across the United States from 2015 to 2018. And if you took all those trials together, no matter what the background of disease was, they had about a 2.7 yield response when those fungicides were applied at R3 over the non-treated plots. Most of these were mixed modes of action. So if you had 2 or 3 ingredients within your fungicide, that increased yield average is about 3%. We do see a better yield response when the soybeans were planted before the 21st of May, and when there was a higher risk of precipitation, where they had above average precipitation. That's also going to lead us to higher risks of those fungal diseases developing within the canopy. The thoughts on this one is, again, using a foliar fungicide is less likely to be profitable when we don't have that risk of those foliar diseases or they're at very low levels. So again, this is just some data we've been compiling to try to look at the effectiveness of, if you just decide to go out and spray all your fields, what is the chances of getting a return on that added input cost for managing diseases. But pulling back the reins a little bit, instead of encouraging everybody just to roll the dice and spray fields, I do want to remind you that we do have fungicide resistance that can quickly develop within our pathogen systems. Frog eye leaf spot, for example, is one that we're tracking right now. And just like when we talked about herbicide resistance, the more times we continue to apply fungicides on an annual basis to the same fields, we're going to select those pathogen populations that are more resistant to that fungicide. So again, just like if we're looking at herbicide resistance for your weeds, the same thing can happen with our fungi. We spray one time, we select for those fungi that may be resistant, that they're already present in the population. And if we continue to apply this pressure year after year, we're going to select for those populations that are resistant. And one example of this is the QOI, the strobilurin resistance that has developed in soybeans. So we do know we have QOI fungicide resistance here in Indiana. In 2010, it was first reported in the United States. It's currently been detected in 18 states, and it may be 19 or 20 by now. That first, before I arrived, they had confirmed 4 counties that had QOI resistance here in Indiana. We started monitoring field populations across the state. I have a student that's working on this project, Natalia, and she was collecting samples through 2019 and 2020 to try to see how widespread is this resistance beyond just those 4 first counties that we've confirmed it in. So in 2019, we were able to collect a number of samples from 10 counties across the state, and of those 10 counties and 144 different isolates that she collected in 2019, 71% of them were resistant to the QOIs. They contain that one gene switch that causes that pathogen population to be resistant to those strobilurin fungicides. We did have one county, though. We were not able to find any resistant mutants from that county, so Lawrence County, we still haven't been able to find that. So again, we've now added 9 new counties. This is from the 2019 sampling. We are currently in the process of collecting the samples. We have over 200 isolates from 2020 to try to get a further how widespread it is. I think she's got 30 different counties she's looking at for 2020. So stay tuned. I suspect that the QOI resistance is pretty much widespread throughout the state, but it is important to understand how widespread and how mixed are those populations. Do we still have populations out there that do show, that aren't resistant to the QOIs as compared to those that are? And then finally, the other things my team has been doing is trying to track various diseases across the state. So not only do we track southern corn rust, but we've been tracking tar spot since its 2018 epidemic. So this is the new 2020 map. As you can see, there are 2 new states, if you want to, that we found tar spot in. Pennsylvania found it this season, and then it also jumped into Canada as well. So the disease is continuing to spread. Here in Indiana, we first found tar spot. It was found in 2015 with 7 counties. Initially, we really didn't see it was going to cause a big impact, But annually, we've continued to add slowly. We slowly added counties. It's been here, it's been present, it's overwintering. So 2018 was the year we had the right environmental conditions. This disease requires a lot of moisture for the spores to germinate. It needs 8 hours of leaf wetness in order to get in and cause infection. So in 2018, when we had that first epidemic, we were able to find it in 25 new counties. 2019, we tried to do a survey and we again added 25 more counties. So we're up to 66 counties in Indiana. And then in this season, we actually got into all 92 counties across the state, adding 12 new counties. But there are 14 counties that we could not find it. Now, granted, we were only got into 1 or 2 fields in a county, depending on our time. But again, there are a number of counties in the southern part of the state that are gray that we still weren't able to find tar spot. But that being said, you know, we were able again this season to find active tar spot in all of those 78 counties. But it's not just important to me to understand whether the disease is in a county, it's also important to understand were the conditions conducive for the disease to really impact yield. So when we go out and scout and look for tar spot, we also take a rating on that field. We rate the severity of the plant, how severe did the infection occur. If we're only finding 1 stromata on a leaf, so this little black spot here, that's really not going to impact yield. It does tell me that the pathogen's present and it may be there for future seasons, but it's really not going to impact yield. It's when we get up to this 5 to 7, the 25% severity, that's when we're starting to see those significant yield impacts that we see. So we took this data, and I just want to acknowledge that the conditions for 2020 were significantly different from 2019. We had a lot of areas where we had high drought, and this is looking at July, looking at the drought monitors. So if we look at 2019, we had some areas with a little yellow area of drought, but in 2020, most of the state was under this bright yellow orange area for drought. And then it's also continued through August. So up in the northern part of the state, where we generally see the impact of tar spot, we had significant dry conditions in 2020. So unless those fields were supplemented with irrigation, we really saw a minimum amount of disease develop when looking at tar spot. So we took that information when we went to the fields. We looked at how frequent could I find tar spot in the corn, so how many plants were infected, and then how severe was that infection. So the first set of maps here on the left is the number of plants that we would find. So the bright orange areas, every plant had a tar spot stromata on it that we looked at in the field. And then the middle is that leaf severity. So how severe was the leaf? The lighter the color, the less severity, lower severity on that leaf. The darker the orange, the more severity. So as you can see from 2019 to 2020, we're starting to see more fields with more tar spot being found more readily across the state. But when we look at the ear leaf severity, those leaves weren't as severely infected in 2020 as they were in 2019. Here, as you can see up in northern Indiana, that's where we had that significant epidemic, and that's where we continue to see this annual problem. When we combine that information together, we get what we call an index, and that's what the maps on the right are showing, is that index map. So again, it's kind of what I've, if we look at 2019, northern part of the state is where we see the most impact on yield, where we're seeing that 11 to 20 bushel yield loss from this disease, up to 20 bushels, 60 bushels as we reported. But if you look at that, which I want to caution looking at southern Indiana, is that we are starting to see these little pockets appear. And I think when you look at the disease triangle, what we're doing is we're slowly starting to build up that inoculum within some of our fields. And then if they're the right conditions, if we have the right rains, if we have the right morning dews, we might be at higher risk for some of our southern fields that may have this disease to see significant impacts in the future. Right now, I still am worried more about northern Indiana, but again, we do have some of these pockets where we're more readily finding the disease than we had previously in 2019. So that being said, the next question is, what do we need to do about it? I'm going to run out of time as I see, but we've been evaluating a bunch of different products, and we just finished our second year of evaluations. What we do is, we have a great spot up at Purdue to evaluate some of these fungicides. We started with our common VTR1 application. We have a 2 to 3 week window where the fungicide is protecting the crop. In our non-treated canopy, we see this rapid disease development at the end of the season. Where we put our fungicides out, we shift that disease curve down. You can see all the fungicides really significantly reduce the disease that develops. But once those fungicides run out of their steam, tar spot can take off, especially if there's still green leaf tissue to infect. So this is what we saw in 2019. We had a similar results in 2020. The disease didn't move in quite as early in 2020. But again, you can see most of our fungicides are reducing that disease curve and reducing the amount of disease that develops within the crop canopy. If we look overall at that area under disease progress curve, so that area under those curves, again, many of our fungicides, and this is looking at the ear leaf -2, the ear leaf, and then the ear leaf +2, across all those leaves, we are able to reduce tar spot within the crop canopy. The question is, what does that mean in the result in regards to yield? So in 2019, there was some variability across our plots. They weren't significantly different, but we do see about an 11.3 bushel per average increase in yield when what fungicide was put out. And if I looked across all the various trials we had across the state, it ran about 11 to 20 bushel on average benefit of putting a fungicide out when tar spot got significantly high in those crop canopies. When we look at 2020, again, we're starting to see some of the new products separate out. There are some that may have a longer persistence and significantly reduce the disease in the crop canopy. And then we look at the effect of those on yield. Here we can see that we had about, some of those products had a 30 bushel average increase in yield over the untreated. So it is good news that we do have some fungicides out there that are really effective in minimizing tar spot, and they do provide some yield protection and minimizing the impact of the disease on the crop. And I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. The other question is timing, and I'm going to skip ahead to so we were trying to decide what's the best timing for fungicides. When we go early at the V7 to V9, we're not shifting that disease curve. Those later application timings seem to be more effective. In 2020, I'm going to skip ahead. We added later application timing. So we had a lot of questions about going out late. If I sprayed at R2, what about R4, R5? So we put fungicides out at all those various timings. And these results are really interesting. And I think I'll stop after this. So the early vegetative stages, we really didn't change the disease curve going out at V8, V10. Those fungicides had run out of steam by the time the disease was active. Our VT, R2 applications, though, really did shift that disease curve down, are helping control the disease. But if we look at R3, R4, R5, they came in too late and they couldn't get ahead of tar spot. So I think it's really important that we need to be tracking this disease and understanding the best timing, and again, staying at our VT, maybe pushing it to R2 would be the most effective for this disease. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. The other thing we were looking at was southern rust. And I just want to acknowledge that we monitor this disease, and this one I think in southern Indiana is the one we need to monitor more closely. Both last year and this year it's moved in early. These are our plots at SEPAC. You can see we got hit really hard with southern rust at the end of the season. We had fungicide trials out there, so this is the non-treated control plot, and then one of our fungicide application plots. So we do know we have fungicides that are really good at controlling southern rust, but again, it's the impact on yield. And really in both years, in 2019 and 2020, we aren't seeing that yield separation that I'd like to see. The disease really just isn't building up enough to really impact the yield. So again, it's monitoring when the diseases move in and whether that fungicide application would provide a yield benefit. So from that, I'm going to end since I've run over time. And I'm just going to share, if you're interested, we try to track these various diseases on my Purdue website. So we'll have both the tar spot, the active counties when we find it in season, and southern rust as it moves in each year from the south. We are working on compiling our 2020 field data, so stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have it out by the end of the month or early January. And again, there's some other publications that are available if you have any questions. So I'll turn it over to questions if there is any, if I zoom through it, if you have any other questions on diseases.
Dr. Chelenko, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. We appreciate your flexibility within that 30 minutes because you had a lot of good data to share. I strongly encourage everyone to follow up with her in her research later on. We can answer a quick question really quick. Let's just do one. We've got a couple in the chat. So if your question is not answered, please get in touch with Dr. Tlenko later. What is your opinion on V5, V6 fungicide applications in corn?
I guess its question is, what are you going to be using them for? If your idea is that you're going to put them out early because you want to get across, but feel that you're going to be managing the diseases, by the time most of our diseases are active, those fungicides are going to be running out of steam. So that's my one comment on going early. I guess that, that's the one question. You're looking at this new diseases, we're still trying to understand its biology. If it jumps in early, that's when maybe an earlier application may be effective. But from the last few years, again, the VT for managing disease-wise, the VTR1 is when we want to go when they're most active, when they're moving up into that crop canopy, when we're protecting that ear leaf and above.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tlenko. Perfect timing. We really appreciate you joining us tonight. We will prepare to move on to our final presentation. Just a few housekeeping reminders. Please do not log off. You must attend the entire program to receive pesticide applicator, private applicator, or commercial credits today. We will be posting a link in the chat immediately following Dave Osborne's talk here shortly. Dave promised to go pretty quick, so we will make sure we give everyone the link. If you are on a telephone, please stay past the end of the meeting. We would like to explain a different procedure for offering you credit since you are not on the screen. So if you're on a telephone and you are seeking pesticide applicator credit, please remain on the meeting toward the end. We will discuss how to certify your credits at that time. With that, I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Dave Osborne, a friend and mentor of mine, our ANR and 4-H educator and County Extension Director in Ripley County. He's going to be presenting our regulatory PARP topic, Drift Watch. Dave, take it away.
Okay, can you hear me and see that?
Switch the display settings. That swap presenter view.
Okay, can you see that?
Yep.
We look good, Dave.
All right, so we're going to talk about Drift Watch. That is underneath the umbrella of Field Watch. Field Watch was developed back in 2012 by Purdue University in cooperation with some other ag groups to be a system for applicators and specialty crop producers to communicate and share information, to make sure that producers had an ability to know where these specialty crops were, where grapes were, where commercial tomatoes, where beehives, things like that, and to be able to connect those. There are 4 different aspects underneath the umbrella of Field Watch. It's Drift Watch. That is for your specialty crop producers. Bee Check is for your bee producers. They don't have to be commercial to be in Bee Check. They can simply be private individuals, but most of these others need to be commercial folks. Relatively new is Crop Check for those that are producing non-dicamba soybeans, organic type crops, row crops. And then Field Check is for the applicators to take all the other 3 in one place to go check and see what kind of specialty crops, bee things, or row crops that are sensitive to some of your treatments. So the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about what Drift Watch is. We're going to talk about what's new. We'll talk about how to get you registered, to register as an applicator or a specialty crop, and then how do you get signs to put up your signs. The mission of this, again, is to develop that communications and awareness between producers and applicators. Back in 2012, we probably did not have an idea of how serious this communication would be. As we know, this past summer, the dicamba products, some of those were pulled to be able to use those after a given date, and some of those are still up in the air. But I know the state chemist in Indiana has doubled their complaints, and even that doubling, a lot of those numbers are those dicamba problems. The dicamba products, the labels actually require you to go to a site and to know what your surrounding crops are, what your adjacent neighbors' crops are. So this is one of those products that was developed, and the need has just increased and become even more important as more and more labels are requiring you to know what's going on around you. So why drift watch? Well, drifts can be very, very expensive. You know, replacing crops, replacing specialty crops, you know, replacing the loss from organic, you know, products can be very, very expensive. The equine encephalitis outbreak that happened in 2019 in some counties, drift watch producers were protected because the companies that went out and treated for these mosquitoes actually downloaded those maps and were able to avoid the bees and the specialty product produced products that could have been affected by those sprays. Again, some labels require applicators to do these checks before they make the applications. And there are crops out there that are $10,000 an acre to replace. So knowing what your neighbors are growing, bees, organics, susceptible crops and things like that are very, very important, and probably more important today than maybe even they were when this was developed. So what's new? Some of the DNR have some areas that the state owns that border agricultural areas. They've added approximately 33 sites in 2020 that are sensitive areas, and they may be sensitive areas because of things that are growing there or possibly sensitive wildlife or species of animals. And then hemp is going to be licensed this year for production in Indiana, and so they're able to add as a drop-down industrial hemp. So you'll be able to determine where a neighbor might actually be growing hemp as a product. Field Check and Bee Check are two new apps for mobile use, and the Field Check is for applicators and growers, and it is a free Android or Apple download. And Bee Check is for beekeepers, and that also is a free Apple or Android download system. So you actually have access to these on your remote devices and not just back in the office. Crop Check was new in 2019. It allows the row crop folks to register their row crops, organic row crops, non-susceptible soybeans, things like that. That allows the row crop person a place to put those row crops. And before, we were having some row crop people that were concerned about their area being sensitive, and they wanted to put those on drift watch and some of those, and now they have their own place for those crops to be put. Membership in Field Watch can allow organizations, large companies, to download or actually stream the products and sites across their application systems so that all applicators in the field have access to this information. And those same applicators can actually use this now to put annotations on there, like this neighbor has a sensitive area, a wellhead very close to the line, or hey, this person wants to know when we're pulling into the field so they can leave because they're real sensitive to smelling products like 2,4-D and things like that, and it causes problems. So they could actually put a phone number on there, contact this person before you spray this field. So that's kind of new this year in the system. So if you look at a state view, you do not have to really log in to view the state view. It's just a whole lot of the little bubbles, the pins that are dropped down in Google Earth. And you can actually simply go to one of those pins, click on it, and when you click on it, it'll give you the specialty crop area. It'll give you the producer's name, the company, It'll give you an email address to contact. It'll have a phone number, and then it'll give you some special notes, what kind of crops are there, what the specialty area is, you know, what the concern is in that bubble. So that's one way to do that, or you can actually go in here and search by address. So if you know the address of the local field and you want to know what's around that area, you can get a more zoomed in view that way. How do you sign up? It's free to sign up for DriftWatch. DriftWatch, again, is for the specialty producers. Bee check is for those that are raising bees. Crop check is for those that are row crop, sensitive type row crops. And then the field check is for the applicator themselves. So to register, you simply go to the site and sign up for an account. And it's about the same way as you sign up for any other internet account. It's pretty straightforward. You're going to put in or select a username. You're going to need to select a password and then re-enter your password. It also asks for an email, and there is a no email at driftwatch.org for those who do not have an email. So they do give you an email that you can put in if you don't have an email, so you can go ahead and get your login set up. The next page is simply going to be your contact information, and it's the same for producers and applicators. So you're going to go in and put in name, address, phone number, street, town, you know, those types of things. You can actually put your commercial pesticide applicator license number on there if you want to as an applicator, so you'll have access to that on your remote devices. So as you sign up as an applicator, you can put what kind of notices you want. Do you want the entire state? Do you want select counties? Do you want select parts of those counties to give you notifications as things change? Because each spring, those row crops, those specialty row crops, the location of bees and beehives may change. So if somebody moves a set of beehives into an area that you're producing in, you can click that you want that notification sent to you, so that you get an update. Hey, something just came into the area that you're interested in. And then you're going to log in to that site. You're going to submit a new site button. You click on the new site button. When you do that, it'll come up and you'll enter the crop information into that, what crop year you're doing, what's your site, your state site or province, what your crop type is. You'll fill out the crop information. The next thing is you'll go to begin a tracing button, and this is a Google Earth, type of product. So when you hit that begin tracing button, you're simply going to trace your field. You're going to draw the border around that field. You're going to hit submit. When you hit submit, it brings up some additional resources, frequently asked questions, and things like that you can attach to that. So this, if you need more help, you can go to this site to hit go, and it'll give you more information of how to fill those sites out. So the registration is very straightforward and very simple to do. So once you get registered, and you register your sites and you can log in. Once you log in, you have an ability to then purchase your signs. They have the beehive signs, the specialty crop signs, the bee check flags. I think the signs are $12 for the first sign, $10 for each sign after that, and the flags are somewhere in that same area. So you can actually put these signs on your specialty crop that people can see those. But you have to be logged in or be able to log in to DriftWatch to be able to order your signs. Again, this system is voluntary. It's not mandatory for people to sign up their crops. But for those of you that are applicators and you're looking at your label and your label says you have to check surrounding crops, this is a great way to to check those surrounding fields to see what crops are out there. It may not be 100% complete, so it may not remove you completely from having to check with some of your neighbors and things like that to make sure you're doing what you need to do to follow label directions and understanding what crops surround you. But it's a great place to start. And if you print this off and put it in your label or in your file for your application records, and the state chemist happens to knock on your door, you've shown due diligence to do what you're supposed to do to check for those specialty crops. So John, that's all I have.
Dave, I want to thank you so much, and I'm sure everyone who's ready to conclude their evening would say the same. I want to thank all of our speakers today, Eileen, Jim, Alex, Sean, Darcy, and then of course Dave here at the end. Thank you so much. Dave, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and turn off your sharing here. I want to thank everyone for attending. It seems like there were essentially no technical glitches. Very, very thankful for that. We've got some great internet here at the Southeast Purdue Ag Center. I'd like to thank all of our regional educators from about 9 different counties who have taken part in assisting with this meeting. It was a great team effort, and I hope everyone on this meeting got something out of it. If you have additional questions, please direct them first to your county educator and then also to the specialists on the call, and we'll be happy to help you.